Hi students, this week we're going to talk about promotion and children. Specifically, the big question we're going to start to really ask ourselves is who should be responsible for regulating what children see? And we're definitely going to be talking a lot about why we need to look at what the impacts of advertising on children, and we need to talk about the regulation and the regulatory environment. So we're going to start with talking just about what is advertising to children and what are the big issues. Then we're going to talk about why they make such lucrative targets, regulation, and then maybe some key takeaways. So the first thing I want to bring your attention to are the two readings that we are looking at this week. The first one is specifically relating to candy advertising to children and the implications for the industry self-regulation. And then the other one is the effect of advertising on children and adolescents. So two very important readings that will give you a good overview of the main issues. I've also posted 3 or 4 podcasts onto My Learning, which I would absolutely encourage you to listen to because they do a really good job of really outlining what the key issues are. Now, when we're talking about advertising in children and promotion in children, there's a couple of things that make this a really important area that we need to study. The first is that we don't really understand the effects of advertising exposure on children, and this is an area that a lot more research needs to happen because we do know that there are going to be psychological developments that affect children's responses to marketing, and advertisers are constantly trying to figure out how to best get inside children's heads. So we need to understand what are those psychological developments and what impact do they have. We need to understand especially the problems associated with advertising in newer media like digital spaces, because this is a brand new area and it's kind of the Wild West. So this is an area that we really need more research in. And then also the big thing that a lot of people are talking about now is how can researchers, parents, and advertisers come together to try to minimize some of the worst effects on children. So these are areas that are sort of ripe for study. They're happening now. A lot of people are talking about them. They're really big key issues that advertisers and people working in the industry really need to kind of understand and think about before you actually start thinking about advertising to children. So why do advertisers want to target children in the first place? Well, quite simply, they're very lucrative targets, right? Children and adolescents actually do spend billions of money on their own purchases, gained through their allowance and, jobs and gifts and things like that from grandparents. And they're very influential on helping families decide what to buy. I mean, you only need to be in a grocery store to see a small child having a temper tantrum over a type of sugar cereal that they want to know that actually, children have a huge influence on what their parents actually decide to purchase. And finally, the most important reason is that children represent a lifetime of brand loyalty. So if you can get children early and if you can get them kind of hooked on a brand and get them loyal to a brand, chances are you're going to have them for life. This is especially true when it comes to things like household products like toothpaste and soap and sort of low investment products where children grow up with these things. They see them in the home. They equate a sense of safety, security with these products, and they end up using them for life. So a lot of brands, especially in the consumer packaged goods industry, are really invested in making sure that children are seeing their brands and wanting their brands because they know that this represents, a lifetime of income. The biggest problem with advertising to children is that, especially under the age of 7, children don't necessarily they don't have the ability to detect when they are being persuaded to. And so what ends up happening is that the children actually take the ads at face value. And so even though, it might seem implausible that a tiger can sell them cereal, and we, as adults, we know we can look at that and say, well, that's obviously an advertisement. A child isn't able to recognize that. So they honestly think that what is being told to them through advertising is the truth and is objective and is non-disputed, and that therefore they need to be able to take advantage of what's on offer. So they're very susceptible, children. They don't understand persuasion. They don't understand manipulation. They don't understand that someone is trying to get them to do something. They're just taking whatever's being told to them at face value and believing it. So they're very susceptible to messages. Now, this can have lots of problems on or lots of negative impacts on children. Now, the first is that research has pointed to a consistent relationship between exposure to advertising and parent-child conflict. Now, we do know that children are seeing up to 30,000 advertisements per year, and that's not even including the digital space. So the more exposure they have to advertising, the more conflict they have with their parents, because they want things, they have material need, they're being told they should be able to have all of these toys, all of this high fat, high sugar content food. And if they can't have it because their parents are trying to parent them, they end up causing a lot of conflict. We're also seeing a real sense in research of a skewed sense of socialization and materialization around children. So they have a really skewed sense of how to actually be in the world with their friends, and they also have a skewed sense of material objects and what they mean and how valuable they are. This is a direct result of the exposure to advertising. There's a lot of research that points to negative body image and low self-esteem correlations amongst students or amongst children who are exposed to a lot of advertising. This is especially in the case of young girls who have a lot of body dysmorphia from looking at advertisements that show depictions of women that are unrealistic. However, there are some positives to children being exposed to advertising. The first is that advertising does allow children to sort of understand the world a little bit better, understand their place in it. And then also, maybe in an indirect way, the more that they have access to advertising and the more access they have to all constant barrage of messages, the more that they might be able to develop an actual skepticism or media literacy. But the research on this is not as strong as the negative impacts that we've seen. The biggest issue right now that we're dealing with is the digital environment, which I called earlier the Wild West, because essentially it's very hard to regulate and it's very hard to control. And children are being exposed to advertising in all kinds of ways on their devices, their phones and their iPads. So games, for example, that are disguised to look like just a regular game are actually created and sponsored by brands. You can see here below, children think they're just playing a game, but actually they're being inundated with brand messaging, especially for candy and unhealthy food choices. They're not able to understand influencers and brand ambassadors, and they tend to take what is being told them by influencers at face value, and they see them as their friends, and they're not being socialized properly with real friends, and so they end up being really susceptible to that message. They also obviously can't recognize product placement, and so when they see brands integrated into their media, they take that as gospel truth that this is actually the way the world works, and of course they want to be like what they see in their media. And then embedded sponsored content, again, if adults can't even recognize this stuff, how would children be able to recognize it, especially when it's in a digital environment where their parents can't necessarily control what they're viewing. And so the hidden persuaders are sort of constantly there trying to appeal to children, and it's really hard to control. And the regulators have simply not been able to catch up. So who should control what children see? At the end of the day, who is making all of the rules about what children have exposure to? Now, the Advertising Standards Authority is the regulatory body in the UK, and they are charged with trying being the operative word, to try to regulate the environment and try to make the rules that advertisers need to follow. Now, there's some areas that they are very, very concerned of. First of all, they want to make sure that advertising is not too close in a school area, and that the school areas are generally free from advertising. Now, this is not the case in America, where schools have been inundated by advertising, but in the UK, they do try to contain a safe distance in schools away from advertising. They obviously will clamp down on anything that has highly sexualized imagery, especially amongst that depicts people who are younger than 18 years old. They are on the lookout for any advertising that might cause fear or distress amongst children, or be in any way that might damage or hamper their safety. Also, making sure that no age-restricted products such as tobacco, alcohol, and gambling is directed at children, and obviously the betting and gaming industries. And then also a new regulation that the ASA has been bringing in since 2017 is to limit the amount of advertising to high-fat, salt, and sugar content foods, because we do know that there is a direct correlation between children's exposure to junk food advertising and the rates of obesity that are steadily climbing in this country and around the world. And in class, we're going to actually do a small case study where we're going to watch a video about some of the effects of junk food advertising to children and what that actually might result in. So the ASA is also responsible for the digital environment, but every time I speak to anyone at the ASA and anytime I read their reports, they're very clear about the fact that they are having a very difficult time catching up to all of the changes happening in the digital environment, because things happen so quickly, and it's the Wild West. How on earth can they actually manage it? So the best they've been able to do is to require #ad on digital content, such as video content, YouTube videos. Influencers are supposed to use it. You're supposed to see #ad on any games that are branded content and any endorsements that children are not going to recognize. Now, again, this is next to impossible to regulate, and it's really up to the advertisers themselves to police it and to actually make the decision to do it. And if they don't, there's very little consequence. They might get called up by the ASA to say, hey, you need to put a #ad on that. And if they don't, there's no system in place for them to be fined or to have to take the ads down. And certainly by the time they've already been up and caught, it's too late. The horse has left the stable and the ad has already been seen. So the biggest problem with advertising to children is that there is no system or clear system of regulation that will actually have any impact on damaging behavior. And the UK, and as well as the US and many other countries, they follow what's called a self-regulation model, which essentially means that the advertisers have to regulate themselves. So at the end of the day, you're basically saying to the advertisers, we've given you guidelines about what we want you to do. We do all recognize that advertising to children is really harmful. We're just going to trust you to do the right thing and to act ethically, because we don't have the resources to stop you. And parents who are overstretched and overreached and who simply cannot control all of the media that their children are consuming, especially on devices, simply don't have the means to be able to police it either. And so at the end of the day, the way the industry works is that we just have to trust the brands to do it for themselves. And if they say they're going to, then we just have to trust that. So what are the key takeaways from this week's lecture? Well, children are highly susceptible to advertising. This is science, especially under the age of 7. They do not have the ability to clock that somebody is trying to persuade them to do something. And so they cannot perceive persuasion. And so therefore they are very susceptible to whatever messages that they are being sent. And they represent a very lucrative target market due to their buying power and their influential power on their parents, but more so because of the fact that they represent lifetime brand loyalty. And that is frankly too good for brands to pass up. And they simply can't ignore it. It's a nearly impossible field to regulate, and so much depends on the goodwill of brands to actually monitor themselves. Now, if you listen to the podcast, you will hear brands talk about the juggling act that they do and the thinking behind what they do when it comes to advertising to children. So it's really important that you listen to these podcasts because it is a highly ethical dilemma and there is no clear answer. And then finally, the Advertising Standards Authority, which is an agency that you will need to get to know, especially if you're going to operate in the UK, will offer clear guidelines, but they really struggle in the digital space. And so there's just no way for them to keep up. So at the end of the day, there is no clear system of regulation in place, and it's going to come back to the brands to actually be the ones to manage it. What we call this is the fox guarding the hen house. If you think about it, it's like saying, here's a hen house full of chickens. We need someone to guard it. Why doesn't the fox do it? We can trust him not to eat all the chickens. That's essentially the way that the regulation and the regulatory environment works for advertising to children. So that's all for today. Listen to the podcasts, do the readings. They're very important. And in class, we're going to talk specifically about junk food advertising in children. The slides are up on My Learning with a lot of good statistics for you to read over before class, and I look forward to having another animated discussion with you.